Nobody called his name anymore. That was the first thing Walter Hayes noticed about dying slowly. Not the weakness in his legs, not the way his hands trembled slightly in the early morning cold, not even the silence that had settled into the space where Evelyn's voice used to live. It was simpler and crueler than any of those things. It was that in 381 days inside Sunrise Gardens nursing facility, not a single person had spoken his name the way another human being speaks the name of someone they love, not once. And Walter Hayes, 97 years old, retired bridge engineer, a man who had once stood on the edge of an unfinished suspension bridge in a November windstorm reading stress calculations while younger men held onto cables for balance, had begun to wonder if he had already disappeared without anyone bothering to tell him. He decided on a Tuesday morning that he was done waiting to find out. He woke before sunrise, which was nothing unusual. Walter had woken before sunrise every day of his adult life, because Evelyn always said the best hour of the day was the one most people slept through. He sat on the edge of his bed in room 214 for a long moment, in the dark, with his hands resting on his knees the way they always rested when he was thinking through a problem. Then he reached for his old brown coat hanging on the back of the door, the one that still carried the faint smell of motor oil and sawdust from a life that felt like it belonged to another man now. He put it on slowly, button by button. He took Evelyn's photograph from the nightstand and slipped it into his left breast pocket, right against his heart, where it had ridden every important day of his life for the past 3 years. He picked up his small red notebook, and then Walter Hayes, 97 years old, retired bridge engineer, a man who had once stood on the edge of an unfinished suspension bridge in a November windstorm reading stress calculations while younger men held onto cables for balance, stood up straight, looked at that room with its brick wall window and its ceiling-mounted television and its single bed he had never once slept comfortably in, and he walked out the front door of Sunrise Gardens without hurrying, without hiding, without asking anyone's permission. Nobody stopped him. The morning air outside hit him like something honest, cold and sharp and real, in a way that the recycled air inside that building never was. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up. The sky was that particular deep blue that exists only in the last few minutes before sunrise, when darkness and light are still negotiating. And Walter stood inside that blue and breathed it in and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was still large enough to hold him. He started walking. Not fast, not desperately, the way a man walks when he has just remembered that his legs still belong to him. To understand what drove him out that door, you have to go back to the Tuesday in March when Evelyn died.
Walter always thought Tuesday was the cruelest day imaginable for losing someone. Not a Monday when the world is already hard, not a Friday when at least something is ending and something else beginning, but a plain, ordinary Tuesday with no significance whatsoever, the kind of day that has no business containing something that large. They had been married 51 years. 51 years of the same kitchen table and the same front porch and the same quiet arguments about the thermostat that neither of them ever really wanted to win. He remembered the last morning, a Saturday 3 weeks before, when Evelyn had stood at the kitchen window watching rain come down in long silver lines, and she had said without turning, "Walter, do you think we've had a good life?" And he had said without hesitation, "I think we've had the only life worth having." She had smiled at the window. He had watched her smile at the window and thought he would remember that moment forever. And he had been right, though he had not known then that forever would arrive so soon. After she was gone, the house became a different kind of structure entirely, still standing, load-bearing walls intact, but hollow in the way that only a home can be hollow, which is different from any other kind of emptiness, because every room holds the shape of what used to happen inside it. Walter would sit at the kitchen table in the mornings, and the chair across from him would be so specifically, so precisely empty that it had a weight of its own. Linda began visiting more often in those first weeks. Walter had wanted to believe it was grief bringing her. He had spent 44 years reading structures, learning to see the difference between something that needed support and something someone had already decided to take down, and he should have recognized sooner what Linda's visits actually were. She would sit across from him at that table and watch him with careful, measuring eyes and ask him questions about whether he had eaten, whether he had taken his medication, whether he remembered what day it was. And Walter would answer patiently because she was his daughter, and he loved her, and because somewhere underneath the patience, he was still hoping he was wrong about what he was seeing. 3 months after Evelyn's funeral, Linda placed a stack of papers on the table and slid them toward him without meeting his eyes. Psychological evaluation, cognitive decline, unsafe to live independently. Walter read every word. He had never signed a document without reading it completely, not once in 44 years, not a single contract or assessment or structural report. He read every word of those papers and understood every word, and then he looked up at his daughter and saw that she was looking slightly to the left of his face, the way people look when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He thought about Evelyn at the kitchen window. He thought about 51 years. He thought about the front porch where they had sat through 100 summer rainstorms with sweet tea cooling in their hands. Then he sighed because he was tired, and because Evelyn was gone, and because the house was already so hollow that maybe it didn't matter anymore where he was inside it. The house sold within days. Walter never got to say goodbye to the porch. Inside Sunrise Gardens, everything was clean and organized and relentlessly polite. Monica knocked on his door every morning at 6:45 and called him sweetheart and guided him gently toward breakfast, and the food was adequate and the sheets were changed regularly, and there was absolutely nothing Walter could point to and call cruelty, except for the one thing that has no name, which is the experience of being cared for by people who will never know who you actually were. Across the hall, a retired firefighter named Frank Delaney spent his afternoons polishing dress shoes that nobody wore anymore, buffing them to a shine with the focused attention of a man who needed somewhere to put his pride. Down the corridor, George Miller, who had taught piano for nearly 50 years, sat most mornings with his fingers moving silently across his knees, playing something no one else could hear. One afternoon, Walter asked him what song it was. George looked up slowly, the way people look when they have been somewhere far away, and the return takes a moment. "My wife's favorite," he said quietly. "She's been gone 9 years, but my hands still remember her." Walter sat with that for a long time afterward, because what George had described without meaning to was the truest thing about losing someone after a long life together. The body remembers what the world tries to forget. The hands remember. The chair at the kitchen table remembers. The specific weight of a particular silence remembers. He started writing in the red notebook to keep himself real. Every day, 3 things: the date, the weather, one memory that belonged only to him. June 11th, rain this morning. Evelyn loved thunderstorms and would open the kitchen window just to hear them better. July 3rd, Linda, at 8 years old, chasing fireflies across the backyard in her pajamas, laughing so hard she could barely run. August 19th, the smell of fresh concrete on a cold morning, which is a smell that has no comparison and which Walter believed he could find again in the dark if he had to. The notebook was evidence, proof that a life had happened and was still, quietly, insisting on continuing. On day 143, Linda called. Walter answered. She asked if he was adjusting well. He asked if she had sold the house so quickly.
The silence that followed was the kind that has texture that you can feel against your face. Then her voice came back, careful and flat. "It was necessary, Dad. Not difficult, not painful, necessary. Like a calculation that had already been made and simply needed to be confirmed."
That night, Walter lay in the dark of room 214 and thought about Evelyn standing at that kitchen window watching rain. And he thought about everything Evelyn had poured into raising Linda, every patient correction and every tender moment, and every night she had sat beside that child's bed and spoken the world into something safe and understandable. And he thought about how all of that love had apparently not been enough to prevent this moment, and he cried in a way he had not cried at the funeral, because at the funeral he had still believed that the people around him were grieving too, and now he understood that some of them had been calculating. He began watching the building the way he had always watched structures. Shift change happened at 7 every morning. There was a gap, 4 minutes, sometimes 5, when the front entrance was simply unattended. He watched this for weeks, telling himself he was only observing, the way he had always observed a new site before committing to a design. Then one morning, he stopped pretending. Weeks before that final morning, during an alternate Thursday library trip, Walter had noticed a handwritten room for rent notice on the community board near the entrance. He memorized the number without touching the paper because he had always had a precise and reliable memory for numbers, which was one of the reasons he had been good at his work, and one of the reasons the papers Linda had placed before him had been so particularly dishonest. He called from the library phone while the supervising aide was helping someone else. Her name was Rachel Carter. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been holding everything together alone for long enough that she had forgotten there was any other way to live. When Walter told her his age, she went quiet and then laughed, a small, surprised sound that seemed to arrive from somewhere genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh a person produces when they have not expected to be caught off guard by something good. He told her about the steel strikes and the heart surgeries. She told him to come by. He did not know until he arrived that Rachel was 3 months behind her mortgage, that her ex-husband had emptied the savings account before leaving, that the kitchen counter held organized stacks of bills the way some counters hold fruit, that her 8-year-old son Noah still kept his father's photograph on his nightstand because nobody had yet found the words to explain to a child that some people leave completely. Walter's pension covered the rent Rachel needed to keep the house, but what Rachel and Noah gave Walter in the weeks and months that followed was not something that could be entered into any ledger he had ever maintained. The first morning Walter woke in that house, real morning light came through a real window and landed on a real floor, and somewhere down the hall a small boy was arguing with his shoes, and a woman was moving quietly through a kitchen, making the sounds that kitchens make
when someone is actually living in them. Walter got up and made coffee for 2 and set Rachel's cup beside her at the counter without comment. And she looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him, and didn't say anything. And he didn't say anything. And that was the beginning of something neither of them had a word for yet, but which both of them recognized as necessary. 3 weeks after Walter arrived, Noah came home from school and walked directly to Walter with both hands extended, holding a drawing the way children hold things they are proud of, completely and without reservation or self-consciousness. A blue house with yellow windows, 3 figures in the yard, a small boy, a woman, a tall old man in a brown coat. "That's you," Noah said. "You're Grandpa Walter." Rachel turned toward the counter. She stood there with her back to the room for a long moment, pretending to look for something, and her shoulders were very still in the particular way that shoulders are still when a person is holding something in. Walter sat with the drawing in his hands and looked at those 3 careful stick figures standing together in front of that blue house, and he felt something move through him that he did not have a name for either. something that lived in the same place where grief had been living for 3 years, filling in the space grief had carved, not erasing it, but inhabiting it the way light inhabits a room when someone finally opens the curtains. Some doors, Walter thought, don't look like doors until you are already walking through them. 5 months after he had walked out of Sunrise Gardens, Linda called. She had been notified, or had started asking, or simply run out of ways to avoid the fact of his absence. She demanded to know where he was. He told her he was with family. She asked who. He told her he was with people who were glad he was still alive. Her voice came back sharp with the particular anger of someone who has been caught not caring and needs to reframe it quickly as concern. Walter let her speak until she was finished. Then he said quietly the thing he had been carrying since the afternoon she slid those papers across his kitchen table without meeting his eyes. He told her that what hurt most was not the house, and not the room with the brick wall, and not 381 mornings of being called sweetheart by strangers. What hurt most was knowing that her mother had spent her entire life trying to teach her how to love people well, especially the ones who could no longer do anything for you in return, and that the lesson somehow had not held. Then he set the phone down gently on the table.
And outside the kitchen window of Rachel Carter's small house in Lexington, Kentucky, the late afternoon light was coming through the yard in long golden lines, and Noah was out there in his jacket kicking a soccer ball against the fence. And the tomatoes he and Walter had planted together in early spring were coming in better than anyone had expected, heavy and red on the vine. And the world was not fixed, and it was not simple, and it was not without its grief, but it was real. And it was present, and it was his. Walter Hayes is still there. Every morning he makes coffee before the sun comes up. Every afternoon he helps Noah with arithmetic because numbers have always made sense to him and always will. Every evening he waters the tomatoes and checks the fence post that wobbles on the left side and needs a proper setting in concrete, which he intends to do in the spring. And every night, before bed, Noah wraps both arms around him, the way children embrace without calculation or reservation, and says, "Good night, Grandpa." And Walter holds on for one moment longer than is strictly necessary, because he understands now what it took him 97 years and 381 days of disappearing to fully know. This story speaks directly to one of the most quietly urgent crises in American life, which is the abandonment of the elderly by the families and systems that were supposed to protect them. It asks every listener to examine what love actually requires, especially when it is inconvenient and costly and invisible to the outside world. It honors the dignity of people who built this country with their hands and their years. It reminds us that belonging is not determined by blood or paperwork. And it tells every older person listening that their life is not finished, their voice is not gone, and their capacity to matter to someone is not diminished by age or frailty or the failures of people who should have known better. That is not a small thing to say. That is everything.